If I can't have rebirth, he growled, blood pouring from his shoulder wound. You'll die with the past. He held her tightly, determined not to let go, intent on dragging her down with the collapsing dimension. The world around them shattered into blinding white. The white world roared around. Amara. It felt as if she were at the heart of a star that had just exploded. All the knowledge, memories, and rage of the ancient entity were collapsing, pulling the dimension it had created down with it. But amid the chaos, a physical pain anchored her. Silas's hand gripped her wounded arm, his fingers like an iron. Vice, if I can't have rebirth, he roared, his face contorted with hatred. You'll die with the past. He was trying to keep her there, to ensure she was crushed alongside the god she had just killed. Amara struggled, but she was exhausted from blood loss and the psychic battle. The pull of the collapsing dimension was stronger than her remaining strength. As her consciousness began to fade, she noticed something strange. Silas's skin, where it touched her blood, was starting to crack. Dark black fissures spread from his hand, and a viscous black ooze seeped out. His fanaticism had allowed a small part of the entity to assimilate him, and now, as the main entity died, the parasite within him was dying too. He was disintegrating. Suddenly, a stumbling figure forced its way between them. It was Omar's body. His eyes were vacant, but the voices emanating from his mouth were now a chaotic chorus of fading souls. The balance must be preserved, they howled. Omar's body, with one final surge of strength, seized Silas. It wasn't an active rescue, but a compliance with a final cosmic law. The jailer had to remain with the prison. The opportunity lasted only a second. Amara summoned her last reserves of strength and wrenched her arm free from Silas's grasp. She didn't look back. She saw a shrinking point of light in the distance, the portal back to reality. It was her only escape. She lunged toward it, her body screaming in pain, her mind blank. She glanced back one last time. Silas and Omar's body were being swallowed by the blinding white light. Silas screamed as his body disintegrated into ash, finally united with his god in destruction. Omar's body went limp as the last souls within it escaped and dissipated. Amara dove through the portal just as it closed behind her with a silent pop, a sound with no air to carry it. She opened her eyes. She was lying on the fleshy floor of the core chamber, but it was no longer alive. The pulsing had stopped. The red light had faded, leaving only the faint glow of her headlamp. The fleshy walls were turning gray, beginning to weep and emit a pungent stench of decay. The blood river beneath her had congealed into a thick, black sludge. The monster was dead. Amara coughed violently, struggling to rise. The room was eerily silent. Nearby lay Callum's deformed corpse, now just a tattered husk of flesh and skin. In another corner, Elena lay motionless, her face frozen in the delirious smile of her final illusion. She was the only one left alive. Single thought drove her. Get out. She dragged her battered body back along the path they had come. The blood corridor was now just a wet, fetid tunnel. The living ribcage had collapsed. The spiral staircase no longer pulsed, but the dried blood pearls looked grotesque under her light dot. It was a long, agonizing journey back from hell. Finally, she reached the bottom of the original well. She looked up. Hundreds of meters above was a small circle of the night sky, a vision of freedom, of life. She had survived. She had won, but as she gripped the first rung to begin her climb, A familiar sensation, a cold, prickling tingle, suddenly shot through her palm. She looked down. The scar she had inflicted was still there, but beside it, a small, dark Kata symbol was slowly forming on her skin, like a tattoo drawn in invisible. Inked out, the whisper sounded in her mind again. But this time, it wasn't the entity. It was an echo. A fragment, lonely. Amara froze. She had killed the monster. But perhaps when she plunged her hand into its heart, a fragment of the abyss had latched onto her. She had escaped. But she hadn't escaped alone. The white light flickered out. Physical reality slammed back, cold and merciless. Amara found herself standing in the core chamber, now in its death throes. The pulsing had stopped. The fleshy walls were gray and weeping, reeking of rot. The blood lake had solidified into a tar-like mass. The silence in the room was more terrifying than the screams before. She was the only one still standing. In the distance were the corpses of her teammates, silent witnesses to a tragedy no one would know. She had won, but there was no sense of triumph. Only emptiness and the throbbing pain in her arm. Her only thought now was to escape. She turned, dragging her broken body through the dying corridors. Everything was decaying. The fleshy walls shrank and shriveled. The blood river had dried, leaving a slimy channel. She passed the living ribcage, now a collapsed cave, then reached the spiral staircase. The climb from hell was a test of pure will. Each step was a mountain. Her wounded arms screamed in protest, and her entire body trembled from exhaustion and blood loss. She could focus on only one thing, the faint circle of the night sky far above, a promise of fresh air, of life. The climb, horrific images flickered in her mind. No longer illusions crafted by the entity, but fractured memories of trauma. She saw Callum's distorted face, his bleeding eyes. She heard Elena's screams. She saw Silas's fanatical gaze. They were shadows that would haunt her forever. And then, the whisper sounded again. It was faint, a mere echo. A stray thought in her mind, cold. Amara froze on the staircase, her heart pounding. It wasn't the entity's voice anymore. There was no power, no rage. It was just a sensation. An alien awareness sharing her mind. She shuddered, trying to push it away and continue climbing. Just psychological aftershocks, she told herself. Just an echo. After what felt like an eternity, she finally reached the top of the well. With her last ounce of strength, she pushed aside the camouflage stone and emerged. The crisp, cold desert night air flooded her lungs like a life-saving elixir. She took a deep breath and collapsed onto the soft sand, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion. She had done it. She had escaped. She lay there, staring at the star-filled sky, a sight she thought she'd never see again. A real sky, not a pulsing red membrane. True silence, not the dead quiet of a tomb. As the first light of dawn began to tinge the eastern horizon, casting the massive shadow of the Khafre Pyramid across the desert, Amara slowly sat up. She had survived. She had won. She looked down at her hand to check her wounds. The gash on her forearm was still there, no longer bleeding. The burn on her palm had subsided, now just a red scar. But beside that scar, the dark Kata symbol she had seen at the bottom of the well was now clearly etched on her skin. It was no longer faint. It was there, a permanent mark. As the first rays of sunlight touched her skin, bringing warmth, the whisper sounded in her mind again. This time, it was slightly clearer, carrying a childlike wonder. Son, Amara froze. All the relief of survival vanished, replaced by a truth more horrifying than death. She had killed the monster. She had destroyed its heart. But when she submerged it in her blood, the tiniest fragment of its consciousness, a spark that had survived 38,000 years of imprisonment, had latched onto that blood. It had latched onto her dot. She had escaped the prison. But now she had become the new prison. The war wasn't over. It had only shifted battlegrounds from an underground city to the body and soul of Amara Khalil. The truth struck Amara harder than any blow from Silas. She hadn't won. She had only changed the shape of the prison. Before, it was stone and flesh. Now, it was her own body and mind. A faint whisper in her head. Lonely, wasn't. A threat, it was a truth. A fragment of consciousness that had endured millennia in a chaotic scream was now confined to a single mind. It was as afraid as she was, but that empathy couldn't linger. Safety came first. She had to leave before the morning patrol began their rounds. Amara forced herself to stand, every muscle in her body protesting in pain. She glanced at her backpack. Her father's journal, the now dead stone sample, and Elena's shattered camera, relics of a tragedy. She slung it over her shoulder, its weight more than just physical. The climb up the spiral staircase was a test of endurance. But this time, it was also psychological torture. Every few meters, the whisper sounded. Again, not words, but simple sensations. When a desert breeze swept into the well, she heard cold. When she looked up at the growing circle of light, she heard bright. It was learning. It was experiencing the world through her senses, like a newborn opening its eyes, a newborn with the memories of a malevolent god. Finally, she reached the top. With her last shred of strength, she pushed the stone aside and emerged onto the surface. The crisp dawn air hit her face. She took a deep breath and collapsed onto the warm sand. The eastern sky was tinged pink, and the shadows of the three massive pyramids stretched across the desert like the fingers of the dead. They were no longer wonders of the world to her. They were tombstones. She lay there, letting the first warmth of the sun thaw her chilling body. Sun, the whisper sounded again, this time with innocent curiosity. Amara shuddered. She had to move, blend into the crowd, disappear. She used her remaining scarf to cover her blood-matted hair and tattered clothes. She hid her marked hand, tucking it into her pocket. Relying on her knowledge of the area, she skirted lesser-traveled paths, avoiding checkpoints, heading toward the edge of the Giza Plateau, where the desert met Cairo's chaos. Her gateway to the abyss was no longer an underground well. It was a dusty highway where she flagged down an old taxi. Airport? The driver asked in broken English. No, Zamalek. Amara replied, her voice hoarse, trying to sound normal. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes briefly curious about her appearance, but he asked no questions. For a Cairo taxi driver, nothing was too strange. As the car merged into the morning traffic, the outside world crashed over Amara like a tidal wave. Horns blaring, street vendors shouting, Arabic music pulsing from a roadside cafe. Thousands of colors, smells, emotions. To her, it was overwhelming. To the passenger in her mind, it was an explosion. Noisy, colors. So many people. Too many people. The impressions flooded her mind, no longer single words but raw streams of emotion. She felt the rush of pedestrians, the frustration of other drivers, the exhaustion of a street vendor. The entire city seemed to scream into her mind. She closed, her eyes clutching her head, trying to shut it out. "You okay, miss?" the driver asked, concerned. I'm fine," Amara lied. "Just a bit carsick." Finally, the taxi stopped in front of an old apartment building in Zamalek. This was the safe house address Silas had given the group. The irony stung. She paid, stepped out of the taxi, and hurried inside. Only when the apartment door closed behind her did she allow herself to collapse. She slid down to the floor, her back against the door, and for the first time in hours, she sobbed. Not out of fear or pain, but from the utter loneliness and despair. She had survived, but she had brought hell with her. As her sobs subsided, apartment silence enveloped her, but her mind was never silent. The whisper sounded again, no longer a simple impression. It had learned to form a question born from her own fragmented consciousness and its own curiosity. "So this is your world, Amara. It's so fragile." Amara lifted her head, staring at her faint reflection in the blank TV screen. The abyss was inside her, and it was learning fast. The silence of the Zamalek apartment was both salvation and torture. It allowed Amara's battered body to rest, but it amplified the whisper in her mind. "So this is your world, Amara? It's so fragile." The question lingered in her head, a cold observation from an entity that had witnessed stars being born and dying. Amara staggered to the bathroom. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Her face was smeared with dried blood and dust, her eyes sunken and wild, her hair matted. But most terrifying was her gaze. There was something alien in it, an awareness not entirely her own. She turned on the faucet, and as cool water touched her skin, the whisper sounded again, this time with pure curiosity. Water, flowing. She began cleaning her wounds. When she disinfected the gash on her forearm, a sharp pain made her hiss. Instantly, a wave of alien confusion flooded her mind. Pain. Why? Why do you hurt yourself? Amara froze. It didn't understand. It couldn't grasp the concept of enduring minor pain to prevent greater harm, like disinfecting to avoid infection. It only felt the pain of its host. She was both a person and a living laboratory for an extraterrestrial consciousness. The next few hours passed in a nightmarish haze of half-wakefulness. She found canned food in the kitchen. As she ate, it sensed taste, salt. When she flicked on a lamp, it remarked, light off. She became an unwilling tour guide, introducing the human world to an ancient parasite. She had no privacy, not even in her deepest thoughts. The real torture came when she stepped to the window. Below was a typical Cairo street, crowded cars, pedestrians darting across, street vendors, a chaotic but vibrant mix of sounds and colors. That's what her eyes saw. Through her connection with the entity, she felt something else. The whisper in her mind ceased being words. It became an image, a vision, an offered dot in her mind. The street below transformed. Pedestrians moved jerkily, like the puppet Callum. Their skin cracked, revealing dark red flesh beneath. Cars became lifeless metal husks. The asphalt road tore open, and a blood river surged forth. The sky turned the red of a muscular membrane. It was the dimension she had just escaped. But this time, it wasn't underground. It was here, on Cairo's streets. A world assimilated. A world infected. Amara screamed and stumbled back from the window, gasping. That wasn't a memory, it was a desire. It was what the entity wanted. It was showing her its vision of a perfect world, unity. Order, no more chaos. Never, Amara whispered, her body trembling. She realized she couldn't sit idly by. Running wasn't a solution. Silence only made the whisper clearer. She couldn't expel it, so she had to understand it. She was the warden of this prison, and she needed to study the prisoner sharing her cell. She opened her backpack, her father's journal, her laptop. The excavation site was no longer the Giza Desert. It was herself. She began her final excavation, not with shovels and brushes, but with a keyboard and yellowed pages. When she opened, an ancient document about a lullaby of the stars. A profound longing and sorrow hit her, its reaction. A thought sparked. It was horrific, but what if she could use it? She experimented. She flipped to a page in her father's journal, speculating on the priestly bloodline's role in sealing passages. A cold wave of fear ran down her spine. Sealing, she understood. She could use the curse's reactions as a guide. She had a psychic compass. Guided by this new method, Amara worked tirelessly. The picture emerged, grander and more tragic than she imagined. Her father hadn't tried to free the monster. He had discovered the prison was weakening and desperately sought to reinforce it. She had misunderstood him, and then she found it. A marginal note led her to the Amarna texts. A fragmented passage about her rite of separation. A spiritual surgery to transfer a parasitic consciousness to another vessel. It was a glimmer of hope, a way out. But warnings in red ink read, the vessel may shatter, the keeper's soul may tear. This wasn't a cure. It was a life or death gamble. Amara leaned back in her chair. The goal was clear. The war. To reclaim herself had a path. She wasn't just surviving. She had to find the right's components. She had to prepare for the surgery of her own soul. Asterisk, the days that followed in the Zamalek apartment were an exercise in coexisting within hell. Amara realized that the entity within her, which she began calling the Whisperer, was not a roaring enemy, but a curious child with the power of a god. It didn't sleep. It was always there, observing, learning through every one of her senses. When Amara showered, she felt its astonishment at the sensation of hot water. Warm, flowing. When she brewed a cup of coffee, she sensed its confusion at the bitter taste. Different. Privacy had become a luxury. Her mind was no longer her own. It was a museum, and she was the sole guide for an uninvited guest. More. Terrifyingly, the boundary between her emotions and its own began to blur. When she thought of Elena and Callum, a familiar grief welled up, but it was swiftly overtaken by another sensation, a hollow, ancient, suffocating loneliness so profound it nearly drowned her. It was its loneliness, the solitude of an entity that had existed alone in darkness for tens of thousands of years. She was feeling the pain of the very monster that held her captive. The mark on her hand became a physical interface for this connection. The Kaida symbol, now a dark scar, would occasionally tingle or warm when the Whisperer spoke or when Amara experienced a strong emotion. It was a psychic shackle, a permanent reminder that she was no longer free. She devoted all her time to researching the rite of separation. The texts were too fragmented, too vague. But with her psychic compass, she could pinpoint the critical parts. The rite required two main components. First, a vessel, then object ancient and powerful, enough to contain a millennia's old consciousness without being destroyed. Second, a catalyst crafted from the keeper's own blood, she found a glimmer of hope in the final pages of her father's journal. He had been obsessed with a specific pre-dynastic artifact, a canopic jar made of black basalt found near Giza, but unlike any other. It was empty, yet impossible to open, and material analyses of its seal yielded no results. Her father believed it was designed to contain something non-physical. The jar, after years in storage, had recently been moved for display at the Grand Egyptian Museum, GEM, just a few miles from where she was. When she pulled up images of the jar online, the Whisperer reacted. A wave of recognition, familiarity, and a hint of fear. Old prison. Amara had found her vessel, but as she delved deeper, she accidentally opened an old photo folder on her laptop. Images of Luxor appeared. Instantly, the Whisperer seized the opportunity. Another illusion flooded Amara's mind, but this time it wasn't chaotic. It was grotesquely beautiful. The Luxor temple was rebuilt, not in stone, but in living, deep red flesh, arranged with perfect, majestic order. The blood river flowed serenely. I can rebuild it. For us, the voice whispered, using us for the first time. A shared legacy. You don't need that dangerous ritual. Embrace me. We can be gods. The temptation hung in her mind. A promise of power, of erasing every failure. Amara stared at the illusion, then down at the scar on her hand. The mark. On the skin, it was a shackle, a symbol of possession. She would never be a goddess. She would only be its most beautiful puppet. She closed her eyes, summoning all her will. No, she said aloud, her voice echoing in the empty room. I am Amara, only Amara. The illusion shattered. The decision was made. She would not become part of a nightmarish paradise. She would be free, or she would die trying to reclaim. She stood. The research phase was over. The action phase had to begin. She changed into clean clothes found in a closet, carefully concealed her marked hand, and slung her backpack over her shoulder. Inside were her father's journal and a mad plan. She walked to the front door, her uninjured hand resting on the handle. She took a deep breath, steeling herself to step back into the outside world. She was no longer a survivor in hiding. She was a hunter. And her prey was an ancient jar, displayed in one of the most heavily guarded museums in the world. The warden was leaving her prison to find a new one for her captive. Amara knew she couldn't stay in the apartment forever. It was a temporary refuge, but safety was an illusion when her greatest enemy resided in her own mind. The plan had been formed, a mad scheme pieced together from her father's desperate notes and fragmented ancient texts. She needed a vessel, and she knew where to find it. Stepping out of the building and merging into Cairo's bustling crowds demanded extraordinary courage. The world outside was no longer the same. Every car horn, every conversation, every passerby crashed into her mind like a raging wave. The whisperer within her, with the boundless curiosity of a child and the sensitivity of a psychic entity, absorbed everything, sending Amara's mind reeling in a fever of borrowed sensations. She arrived at the Grand Egyptian Museum at noon, not as an archaeologist but as an ordinary tourist. She bought a ticket, blended into the crowd, and felt a nauseating contrast. Just days ago, she had been in a living tomb, an ancient, dark, blood-soaked structure. Now she stood in a modern architectural marvel of glass and steel, filled with the laughter and chatter of tourists from around the world. They came to marvel at the past. She was trying to bury it. She wandered through the exhibit halls, condescending to admire golden sarcophagi and colossal statues. But her mind was working. Over time, she memorized the positions of security cameras, the paths of staff, the blind spots. She was mapping out her heist dot as she approached the pre-dynastic artifact section. The mark on her hand began to tingle, then turned to a cold, burning sensation. The Whisperer, which had been curiously observing the crowd, suddenly fell silent. A silence born of fear. And then Amara saw a dot. It stood alone in a reinforced glass case, illuminated by a single spotlight. The black basalt canopic jar. Compared to the opulent artifacts around it, it looked unassuming, almost invisible. But Amara didn't see with her eyes alone. She felt it. While every other artifact radiated a faint echo of history and energy from those who had crafted and used them, this jar was an absolute void. It was a psychic black hole, absorbing all surrounding energy. No! A silent scream of pure terror erupted in Amara's mind, so intense she staggered and braced. Herself against the wall. The Whisperer had recognized it. That prison! No! Get out of here! It was panicking. For the first time, Amara felt its genuine fear. That only strengthened her resolve. She had found the right place. That night, Amara returned. She didn't use force, she used intellect. With an old antiquities ministry ID card in her knowledge of security protocols, she slipped through a back entrance used by research staff. The museum at night was an entirely different world. The vast corridors were now empty and echoing, shrouded in dim shadows. The colossal pharaoh statues cast long, ominous silhouettes, as if they were sentinels watching her. A prehistoric whale skeleton suspended from the ceiling looked like the frame of a sea monster. The Whisperer in her mind was now screaming, a cacophony of fear and threats. It tried to distract her, projecting illusions of a burning Luxor, of the puppet Callum, of Silas's face. But Amara was prepared. She gritted her teeth, clinging to her goal. The pain from her wounds, a familiar companion. She used the Whisperers, fear as her compass. The closer she got to the exhibit, the more intense the cold burn in her hand became, and the louder the screams in her mind grew. Finally, she reached the pre-dynastic exhibit hall. It was cloaked in darkness, lit only by faint security lights. She stood before the glass case. Inside, the black basalt jar seemed darker than the surrounding shadows, a piece of the abyss displayed reverently on its pedestal. The screams in Amara's mind had turned into desperate pleading. Don't. Please. Anything but that prison. Amara placed her uninjured hand on the cold glass. Her reflection stared back a pale, exhausted face, but resolute. She could see the thin red laser beams of the security system sweeping inside the case. Disabling it would require expertise and tools.
In the shadow of my archive, a new horror stirs. Date to listen.